Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for night one of Freedom from Torture's Resilience Readings Literary Festival. We have such a remarkable and thought-provoking programme lined up for you tonight and over the next 3 days, and we are very grateful that you are joining us from your home. The theme of resilience is an important and timely one for us right now. I was struck by a headline in one of today's papers: resilience, the quality we all crave. We really hope that these readings, these conversations can bear witness to and help strengthen that resilience. And I hope that our literary festival will move and inspire you to deploy resilience, whatever you are going through. Resilience is certainly something that the torture survivors who we work with really need. None of us can escape the effects of this dreadful pandemic, but it's not difficult to imagine how extraordinarily challenging it has been for torture survivors. These are people who are already burdened with the trauma of their torture and exile, often living in crowded and substandard accommodation, without the money to buy what is necessary to feed and keep themselves safe and their families. Thanks to our generous donors like you, we've been able to continue supporting survivors throughout the pandemic, delivering vital therapy online, by phone, and now face-to-face again too. Ensuring survivors are in safe and secure accommodation and providing emergency relief payments for survivors to buy food and basic essentials such as hand sanitizer. This support includes keeping our creative groups running, and we are proud and excited to hear from torture survivors in our writing group, Write for Life, and the Sing for Freedom Choir later this week. They will show us how they use poetry, storytelling, and performance to express themselves and take control of their past experiences, transforming ugliness and pain into powerful beauty. I hope you can join us. First, kick off our literary festival, we have a very, very special book club, the Resilience Reading List. We have the quite brilliant Nikesh Shukla, Louise Doughty, Fiona Shaw, and Caleb Femi, discussing books that have got them through a difficult time and books submitted by you. Unfortunately, Juliet Stevenson is unable to join because of a close family bereavement, but we are grateful and honoured that Fiona Shaw agreed to step in. Please feel free to use the Q&A box on your screen to put questions to the panel. A full resilience reading list with all of your book recommendations will be available after the festival. And so with that, over to the panel.
A book club with three amazing writers. I'm really excited to talk to all of them. Thank you so much to Freedom from Torture for hosting us tonight. So just to introduce you to our panel, we have the wonderful author of 9 novels, Louise Doughty, who is coming to us from an undisclosed location somewhere. Hello, Louise. How are you doing?
Hello, thank you. And I'd like to apologise to everybody. You've just got a still photo of me, which of course could be an improvement, but I am actually far away and having technical problems, but I can hear everybody clearly, and I hope you can hear me too.
And we have the poet and author of I should have said Louise's book Platform 7 came out in paperback just at the start of lockdown in April of this year, and it's an excellent book. Next we have Caleb Femi, who is the author of the incredible book Poor, which I was really lucky to read an early copy of, and it's just one of the most extraordinary collections of poetry I've read in recent years. It's got a quote from Michaela Coleman, which is pretty cool. And our final person on the lineup is the actor Fiona Shaw. And I will try my best to not ask Fiona if Caroline is a member of the 12, which has been my season 1, episode 1 suspicion about her. I'm obviously referring to the character that Fiona plays in Killing Eve, one of many amazing things that she is starred in. How are we all?
Excited.
Yeah.
Great. So the theme of the festival is resilience, and I guess one of the reasons for putting on the book club is because I don't know about you, but I tend to turn to rereading old favourites in times of crisis, or times when I'm not feeling amazing, and I've found myself during lockdown rereading some of my favourite books, just to kind of books can sometimes feel like an old friend. I was talking to the panel earlier about my obsession with issue 33 of Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man, which is an issue I go back to a lot, where Dr. Octopus has dropped an entire building onto Spider-Man, and he has to summon up the inner strength of Peter Parker in order to free himself from this building, and in so doing self-actualize and become the superhero that we know and love. And I'm really excited to talk to some of the book club choices that you've all brought in, but I just wanted to kind of get a sense of how you've been fared in lockdown in terms of reading. Like I've struggled to read new fiction. I've really found myself, as I said, rereading poetry, rereading old classics. So, Louise, if I could come to you, how have you found in lockdown? Have you found it something that you've really taken to, or something that you've found difficult?
Well, I'm going to be honest, I've really struggled as well. I found, particularly in the first lockdown, just my concentration was really poor. And I think it was the rolling uncertainty. And it was a real lesson, I think, considering the subject matter of the festival, on how uncertainty is so dreadful on a mental level. And I mean, I've had a perfectly comfortable lockdown, but just not knowing what was going to happen. I've got one child who lives in a different country, borders were closing. It was, and I found, like you, I found it very hard to take an interest in new books, even my own, as you kindly said. Platform 7 came out, paperback at the height of lockdown in April. I couldn't care less. My books seemed insignificant. Other books seemed insignificant. And like you, what really saved my reading was going back to old favourites, and also just doing something simple like poetry. Caleb, I returned to poetry in a way I hadn't for years, and short novels. There were certain sorts of reading that felt easier than others.
And what about you, Caleb? Obviously, your first full collection came out in was it last month in October, and it's a really accomplished collection. How has that experience been for you?
Lockdown was an interesting one because the book should have come out in July. Lockdown happened and it was pushed to November, which when you're sitting on your first sort of offering as an author to the world, it's already a very anxious state to be in, and then the lockdown comes and uncertainty creeps in, and then there's this futility of everything that then just challenges the graft that you have put over the last couple of years into making this thing. I struggled also to concentrate, to read anything long form. Poetry was something that I didn't even want to look at on like you guys. I found myself reading for a lot more philosophy at the time. To me, to philosophize just what was going on during the lockdown was something that sort of was a bit of a nail to the situation. I found myself returning to classics, books that I've loved, that I consider classics, or modern classics at the very least, which we'll end up talking about later on today. But more than anything, I think I used it as a time to exercise patience and relinquishing any sort of control or sense of control that I felt like I had in this universe. It was a very humbling experience.
Yeah, and when I read your collection, and I know this is always weird to read a poet's work back to them. One of the finals of the book, there is no flash flood coming. Breathe in chaos and breathe out my soft lips, and if you wish me to speak, I will. I thought it was one of the most moving closing lines to a book that I'd read in ages, and reading it in the time that we were in, I just, it was just the right right book for the right moment. So really thank you for that, and go out and buy it, people. It's a really exceptional piece of work. And finally, Fiona, you have been, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but you've been filming the past few months, and how has lockdown been for you? Have you been turning to new things? Have you been revisiting old favourites? How's it been?
Yeah, well, I mean, initially we stopped. I was halfway through a project when we were sent back. We were in Budapest and we came back in March. So I did sort of the opposite of Louise and Caleb. I thought I really got to read the things that I've meant to read for ages. So I read The Divine Comedy, which I had never read. And I read Donata's The Goldfinch, because it was always too heavy to carry. I read the new biography of Ted Hughes, which is also too heavy to carry. And I had a ball. And when you say revisited, I revisited Joan Didion, who I think is the most magnificent writer. So, and I did Ernest Hemingway. I'd Movable Feast. So I began to move towards American writing, and I felt I was kind of catching up with stuff that I really had wanted to swallow before. So I did that. But the second lockdown, I was forced back into finishing this piece of work, and that's been a nightmare for reading. So that's why I've chosen poetry as being the thing at least I can grab in a bag and have a look at.
So I learned very early on in my career that you should never blag having read a book, and so I'm going to do that rare thing and be an author that admits I've always meant to read Joan Didion, but I've never got round to reading her work.
Just get it. Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Just get it and read it. She sinks you into the disaster of the 1960s. Everything that we thought was really cool wasn't, and it's just, they were, and also that these children, which she says they were, these 16-year-olds who were, being full of flower power, they were the children of the disappointed generation after the war. It's a complete revelation. I found it really, it's not that it damns the 60s. You just begin to see it, the movements in America that we are, absolutely facing into only now, having endlessly buried them under other movements. Fabulous. Fabulous.
Okay, I will definitely go and check that out. Okay, so we are going to come to the first book in our book club tonight. Obviously, the theme is resilience. So, Louise, the two books that you've brought, and I'm going to kind of give you some time to talk about them both, is Beloved by Toni Morrison and Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. Tell me about why you picked them, and also why you think that they give you resilience, and also if you can kind of unpack what that word means to you, that'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I thought it would be interesting to choose a fiction and a non-fiction choice. And I think what these two books have in common is that they both tackle the most serious and appalling of subject matters. In the case of Beloved, slavery in America, and in the case of the Being Mortal, death, how we all face death. And yet, to me, they offer us such resilience in terms of the clarity with which they approach the subject, in terms of the lack of sentimentality, and in the terms of which, in their very different ways, they both give us hope that dreadful offence can be overcome, or if not overcome, somehow managed, and how we can draw redemptive lessons from them. And I'll take Beloved first, because it really does warrant being talked about in a bit more detail. I'm sure many people who've tuned in have read it, and if you haven't, then you have to read it immediately. In fact, yes. As soon as you come off this event, you have to get hold of a copy, because I do think it is a masterpiece. I think it's one of the greatest novels ever published, quite frankly, I think it's certainly one of the great novels of the 20th century, if not of all centuries. It first came out in 1987, and Morrison went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1993. It was made into a film in 1998, which I've never been able to watch because I love Beloved so much that the thought of actually watching a film and seeing the possibility that there could be any sort of Hollywood sentimentality about it is unbearable. But it's set in Ohio in 1873, and the main character is a woman called Setha, who has been a slave in Kentucky, but she's managed to flee with her children. She's crossed the Ohio River. And as the novel opens, she's living in her mother-in-law's house with some of her children, or rather one of her children. The house is called 124. It's known as that in the neighborhood. And everybody avoids it because it's rumored to be haunted. And you find out very quickly that it's haunted by a malicious sprite who is the ghost of a baby, a small daughter that Setha killed rather than have taken into slavery when she was about to be recaptured. You find that very early on. She's got one surviving daughter, Denver, and her two young sons have run away. And as the novel opens, she's being visited by a man called Paul D. That's the initial D, because there's more than one Paul in the novel. And Paul D and Setha were slaves together on Sweet Home Farm 18 years before. And through flashback, you find out about what happened to them, how they survived, how they escaped. And I think what I really want to say about this book is that everybody talks about it in terms of the seriousness and appalling nature of the subject matter. But what people say less frequently is that this is such a work of art. It's such a brilliant novel. And I would urge anyone who ever wants to write their own novel to read it, because it really shows you what fiction can do. It shows you how you combine realism. It shows you how you can write about horrific events in such a simple and effective way. There's so much in this book. It bears rereading again and again and again. And the idea that Morrison could take that subject matter and make a thing of such amazing gifts that will survive for decades to come, I think it sort of fills your heart with hope, really. And that's why I wanted to bring it to the table.
Yeah,
Louise, can I ask a question about it?
Yes, of course, yes.
There's a marvelous, I think when you say it's full of hope, isn't it because in some ways it's a weird sort of offshoot reworking of the Medea myth that one could kill a child for a good reason, not a bad reason. And that's an appalling thought in humans. But that when she sees the girl who she believes to be her dead daughter, it's got this surreal, I'm saying that because I think resilience is about the human ability to make a surreal thought become a real thought. And that's how we escape the unbearable. Or not escape, how we face the unbearable.
Yes, I think so. And I think what I admire so much is that she does provide hope, but never at the cost of truth. You're never left in any doubt of how horrific these events have been. There's not an ounce of sort of false sentimentality or reassurance. The psychic legacy of these appalling events that have happened to these wonderfully drawn human beings. You really live their lives, you walk in their shoes. And a history book can teach us the facts about such horrors, but I think a novel can really make us live it on a very deep and human and empathetic level, and that's what makes it such a masterpiece, I think.
Yes.
The thing that I always find about Toni Morrison, who sadly died last year, is she's one of those writers people jump to quote her amazing writing about race, the amazing essays, and she's endlessly quotable. I quote her probably one of her quotes about racism the most out of all of the things that I quote. But I'm really glad, Louise, that you drew attention to her craft, because sometimes I don't think it's talked enough about what a beautiful writer she was, just on a sentence by sentence level. She was the novelist's novelist, and I'm really glad that that's being celebrated here as well. Very much so, yes. Should I talk a little bit
about Atul Gawande now, and then before we move on, I'll keep that short because I know we have limited time. I mean, Being Mortal was published in 2015. Atul Gawande is an amazing American surgeon, and I think it's just very apposite for the times we're living through, because it's really about the whole issue of extending life at the cost of quality of life. And it addresses it. It goes into hospices. It goes into final care wards at hospitals. I think, as a middle-aged person who's already lost both parents, it's the book I wish had been around before I lost my parents, so that I could think more deeply about, what is it, this human obsession we have with extending life at all costs, without actually thinking about the quality of final years, the quality of our endings. And it is a hopeful book, because I think it shows you that even though there is this full stop that awaits us all, that it can be peaceful and beautiful if we actually think about the quality of life, and not just about living for as long as we can at all costs. And so, yes, again, although it sounds like dark subject matter, I do think it's a hopeful and just a brilliantly written book. I mean, as well as being a surgeon, the man can really write. Very, very impressive, I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So just before I bring in Caleb, I just want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. I can't see yours, no idea where it is, but if you want to ask us, that's the way to do it. Please make those questions respectful and nice. And also just a reminder, this is not a question. It's just a question, more of a comment really, and then a 30-page anecdote. It's always men. Why do men do that? I don't know. Anyway, Caleb, tell us about the books that you are tabling for this lovely book club about resilience.
Right. So I'm tabling a book that I read in sixth form a few years ago. I guess the one of the most difficult contemplations about the human experience is romantic love, and what a wonderful but also quite traumatic thing that is. It's a book by Alain de Botton called Essays in Love, and what I love about this book, not only is Alain de Botton such a gifted writer and such a delicate writer, one that almost pirouettes from sentence to sentence in such a graceful way, is the format of the book, which at the time blew me away. It's essentially it's a story that on the face of it seems quite atypical, in a sense. One person meets another person and then they embark in a romantic relationship and it ends. What's unique about it is that so he attaches these mini philosophical essays with each chapter and each section of their relationship as he charts it along. There's an incredible opening chapter where he so the young man meets a woman on a plane. They happen to end up sitting next to each other through strange circumstances, and he does this mathematical calculation as to the odds of meeting someone in such a manner, and then the odds of liking someone and the odds of falling in love with someone and all of that. And then he mixes that maths with philosophy. I picked up beautiful philosophical analogies and theories such as romantic terrorism, which was something that actually helped me process a whole lot of, I don't know, you're in sixth form and falling in love is as frequent as tripping up and down any flight of stairs, really. And and you kind of need some stabilizers to sort of figure that out. And he does it in his own way, ways that make you, that illuminate things for you, but also make you question your own thinking, but also refute some of his ideas as well. It's a lovely book to to read, because I think in a way it kind of did that therapeutic quality of it will save you a few bob in therapy. Also, it would do a long way with just, I don't know, emotional maturity or whatever. And then the second book is by Roger Robinson. It's called A Portable Paradise, which won the T.S. Eliot Prize last year. It came out last year as well. It's a wonderful book, and speaking of resilience, it was a collection of poetry that really helped me. Especially, I know I said I didn't read any poetry, or didn't want to read any poetry during lockdown, but there were collections that I had already read, and there were lines and quotes from there that really stayed with me and helped me through that time. Roger has this section in his poem, the title poem actually, where he says, and if your stresses are sustained and daily, get yourself into an empty room, be it hotel, hostel, or hovel, find a lamp and empty your paradise onto a desk, your white sands, green hills, and fresh fish. Shine the lamp on it like the fresh hope of morning, and keep staring at it till you sleep. And that was such a wonderful quote that really steadied me during that time of that first lockdown. I mean, essentially, in the same way that it has that I speak about Alain de Botton's book and its philosophical quality, I very much feel like this collection by Roger Robinson has that underlying tone of philosophy as well, where he kind of poses this for me a universal truth that, you know, our joys are within, our earthly joys. Where we can find paradise is within the self, and not necessarily an external location. And in some ways, that's a beautiful reassurance during uncertain times, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I love how these are both ultimately very hopeful books. I mean, the Roger Robinson's collection is such a joyous book. You know, that collection for me is so much about life, and it's so filled with life on the page that it never feels like it's wallowing, and it's always on its feet, and it's always so light and keeping it moving. And I think that's something really lovely. Cool. Thank you so much. So our next person bringing books to the book club is Fiona Shaw. Fiona, you've chosen 2 poetry collections, I believe.
Well, in response to the request about resilience, I just thought that it was the most immediate thing. I mean, I could have chosen many other books. I was thinking of Sebald, and so I chose poetry as being the thing that, it's really what Caleb and really what Louise is saying, that you want something that dares to say things as it is. And somehow that is always more comforting than trying to run away from one. And so I picked, I mean, it's not entirely arbitrary. I have a huge long-term relationship with Emily Dickinson, who I think does this thing that that I think that Louise mentions, you know, his in Beloved, where they dare to use a tense or an idea that could not really exist in life, but is life. She has marvelous poems. I mean, a poem that begins with, "I heard a fly buzz when I died." There is an impossibility in the sense, but we absolutely know what it is. A poem about that step from life into death and actually looking backwards. "I heard a fly buzz when I died." Or, I mean, there's a marvelous poem which does go into Caleb's, I mean, the romantic love, which I don't know, you don't need to know anything about her biography, but it goes, "I cannot live with you, it would be life." I mean, that's just such a fabulous quote. And life is over there, behind the shelf. I mean, just the daringness of the humility of knowing what you cannot have and being able to find language that can say it. These in-between feelings, not the feelings of I hate you, I love you, I'm buying another burger, I'm not. It's these strange shadowlands that so much of our minds live in when we're trying to cope with something. So I think I could just, there are endless quotations from Emily Dickinson. She writes a poem about two soldiers who are dead and they're in similar coffins next to each other. So she dares to play with that afterlife moment, and she dares to allow the mind to be free. I mean, Yeats does it too, but I just want to pick Yeats again. When he's um, I don't know that the grief, with things were walking overhead or the stars, a crowds of stars, all this animation of the natural world that is impossible to see, but is our reality. And then I also picked, because I was looking through the bookshelves looking for it, and I remembered that at the beginning of lockdown, I had refound this book, Stag's Leap, which had won, I don't know if it won the T.S. Eliot Prize, it may have, it won the Pulitzer Prize some years, and it's, of course, by Sharon. And it seems on the face of it, a tragic book about her daring to look back at her husband's, she's very happily married, or thought she was, and it's a book about the grief of losing a man who she loved because he went off with somebody else, but she never stops loving him, and there's a sort of super humility in it. And may I quote a bit of it?
Oh, please do.
Well, there's one phenomenal poem, and actually I was looking before we came on air trying to remember it. There's many poems about how much she loves him. She describes him. She physically describes him, and this is years after he's left her. But there's a wonderful bit when she discovers his betrayal, and she discovers it in a very, very prose-like poem about finding a photograph of a woman in the back of his tennis shorts when she puts them in the washing machine. So it's very mundane. And she says, I found this photograph. And he says, oh, I don't know why that's there. And this is all in the poem. I won't read the whole thing. And then some hours later, he says, oh, actually, yes, I do know the photograph. She gave it to me. Just this colleague at work gave me this photograph. So you see the world changing. And then she writes, he smiled at me and took my hand and turned to me and said, it seemed not by rote, but as if it were a physical law of the earth, I love you. And we made love. And I felt so close to him. I had not known he knew how to lie. And his telling me touched my heart. Just once later, in the day, I felt a touch seasick, as if the deck were tilting under me. And it goes on, but I think that's marvelous because we all feel it tilting under you. When somebody says, no, it's fine, something's fine. And underneath you feel seasick. That is the feeling. That is true.
That was beautiful. What was the name of that poem again?
This poem, it's in the poem is called Stag's Leap, but this little poem is called Tiny Siren. But I just loved the word seasick and that the deck's tilting under me. I've felt that so often about a lot of things. If you have any concern about ever feeling, my hunch is this, but everybody says, no, I'm wrong. And you go on feeling that hunch. And then you compromise by agreeing with the group or whatever it is. And you feel slight. And some weeks later, you realize you were right. And it's not about being right, because right is never a happy place, but that your instinct was engaged with being right, and that usually is right. So the seasick is the override of her deep understanding that he has been unfaithful, with the override of him saying, but I love you, and they make love, and all is fine. I think I find great comfort and her resilience and the resilience of humans and the necessary reminding of humans that we must listen to our instinct. We are often right.
I know that the theme of the book club that we're doing is about resilience, but I'm quite interested in this idea of escapism as well. You know, because we don't always read books to kind of see ourselves and take comfort. Sometimes we read to escape, and I wonder if you guys would be happy to the types of books that you turn to when you just feel the need to kind of take yourselves out of your present day. Louise, can we come to you?
I would probably read classics if I just wanted to think of a world that wasn't our world. You know, I would read. I don't really have a guilty pleasure in the sense that there's no necessarily light genre that I would go to, because I think if I wanted not to think about language and words, I would go for a visual medium. I'd look at art, or I'd watch TV or something like that. But in terms of reading, I would go back to something like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, or Graham Greene, The End of the Affair, which is just such a perfect, poised, you know, gripping and bitter little book. You know, those are the kind of things that I would read for escapism. I think things that I was already familiar with, and I would go back to, you know, as you said, like an old friend. That's what I would do for escapist reading.
What about you, Caleb?
I'm quite similar in that way as well. I think as a writer now, I love to read a wide range of genres that I feel like I can escape into, but at the same time, I'm also sort of, I guess, tracking the art of writing in it. So there's always a loose thread that keeps me tethered somewhat in a way. I think usually when I want to completely escape and immerse, I go right back to books that I read as a kid, and in that way, I'm 10 years old again. I'm 12 years old again, and I'm reading like Jacqueline Wilson and stuff like that. And you zoom through it this time because you know it, but there's a sort of nostalgic flavor that you sort of get to feel that the world is very much different, and your responsibilities are yet to find you because they're a few decades away. So yeah, I usually end up reading stuff that I read as a kid.
Oh, actually, Caleb's just reminded me. Sorry, thank you so much, Caleb. That the childhood reading of fantasy and science fiction, I was a big fan of when I was younger. The Ursula Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness, and the Sparrowhawk novels, The Wizard of Earthsea. I mean, gosh, you can't get more escapist than those. Thank you for reminding me, Caleb.
Thank you. What about you, Fiona?
Well, I must say, I feel life is short now, and I don't particularly want to escape. I want to find out about it before I die. But there are some wonderful books. If I go back to things like The Mill and the Floss, the arrival of the aunts to the house is one of the funniest chapters about all Maggie Tulliver's aunts arriving, and one of them are, you know, they're all more stupid than the next, and none of them have, you know, and they're vain and they're snobbish, and that, I mean, that is. I could pick up that chapter now and just have a read of it and read the whole thing again and love it. So I don't know if that's escapism, because it's actually brilliantly true. It's nothing like your spider. You have a Spider-Man fantasy, don't you? That's your.
Yeah, I think that's probably why I turned to comics. There's something so immersive about just losing yourself in episodic action. You know, it's pure escapism. It's pure enjoyment. And I think Spider-Man more than the other. You know, I don't go in for the sort of dark, gritty superhero things that men on the internet seem to love. But I think Spider-Man makes me feel like a teenager again. You know, as Caleb was talking about, that sort of idea of recapturing something from your youth. So we're gonna start looking at some of the questions that people have been submitting now. Just a reminder that there is a Q&A button somewhere on your screens, and if you click on that, you can ask us a question. Okay, so we have a question from Simran, who would like to hear more about Morrison's technique, her literary technique.
Who is so accomplished that it almost defies analysis. There's a lot of good writing where I would look at it and I would say, oh, you know, there's a beautiful line of description, or there's a lovely turned metaphor. But I think the poetry in her language is amazing. And I think also the simplicity with which she recounts some of the most terrible events in Beloved. There's an absolutely heart-stopping description of a lynching where she comes at it obliquely, by which I mean she doesn't say sort of very baldly, you know, this happens, then this happens. She describes what the landscape is like, and somehow the beauty of the landscape makes the horrific events that are happening feel even more horrible, even though she's not actually saying how horrible they are. Falling scene, she says the grass is slick with dew. And it's such a compelling phrase because it makes you think of blood, it makes you think of death. It's and yet if she had said there was blood everywhere, it would feel it would be so hard to take that I think your mind would balk. But she's so brilliant at using both beauty and the description of the beauty in a way that keeps you reading the page. It kind of sucks you into the prose. So instead of balking at the horror of what you're reading, the horror of what you're reading actually slips in through the back door. You carry on reading because you can't stop reading because it's so well written, even though you don't want to read because of the subject matter. And I think that is really where her genius lies, really. I think, you know, genius is a huge word, and it's not a word that I would ever throw around lightly, but I would use it about the prose style and the way in which Beloved is written.
Are Caleb and Fiona, are either of you Toni Morrison fans?
Absolutely. Yeah, the bluest eye is one that evokes that sense of that was my sort of first real immersion into her work, and I think similarly I grew up hearing Toni Morrison quotes, but hadn't actually had an opportunity to really get into her work because her quotes were so, you know, they almost were so large in life that you kind of end up feeling like you know her work, which you absolutely don't until you immerse yourself. The Bluest Eye was my first immersion, and I felt that same breathtaking gasp, like, wow.
I think it's worth saying quite often. Sorry, Nikesh, go ahead.
No, go for it, Louise.
No, it was just really your point earlier about how it's so important that we give these writers credit for their artistry. I mean, I was thinking recently about Andrea Levy, the late great Andrea Levy, who is a good friend of mine, and everybody talks about Small Island, her huge work, because of the Windrush generation and because of the Windrush scandal. And actually, it's not become such a huge bestseller loved by millions of people because it's an issue-based book, but because it's just a wonderful read. It's like Jane Austen. It's this fantastic quartet of voices. It's mistaken loves. It's all these wonderful human qualities. And I think occasionally we burden some books with this kind of sort of slightly weird mixed compliment that, you know, they're great because they tackle these issues or because they tackle such horrific subject matter. But no book becomes beloved by so many people just because of that. It's because of the humanity and the craft and the beauty and the skill in those books as well. And I do think it's important to remember that.
I
Yeah,
agree. And when it's very hard to name, but when you talk about beloved, when you think of the sunflowers of Van Gogh, it doesn't, the subject is, of course, huge. The sunflowers is not a huge subject. Beloved subject is. But I remember where I was when I read Beloved and how it nailed me to the spot. I remember I was in Thaxted in Essex. I remember reading it, and it's informed every painting or every bit of American art I've seen since. It goes right into you because it is a great book. And it's in the quality of the writing subject.
So another question we've had from Verity, I don't know if we've covered this, but I'll table this just in case we have anything more to add. Do the most helpful books for troubled times hold up a mirror to your personal situation? Or does escapism give a reader the best route out of a bad place? Caleb, do you want to take that one?
It's hard to say, really. I think it's we respond to whatever situation we're in different ways. Sometimes escapism ends up being the thing that helps us. Sometimes it's the thing that hinders us. So I think it's definitely down to personal experience, case by case. Hard to say, hard to pinpoint anything on that. I know it's such a answer, but yeah.
No, thank you. That was really helpful. Another question we had from Felicity: was literature and poetry brought alive for you at school? And if not, how could it have been different? She wants to ask that to all of you. I'll stay now and we'll work our way around. Shall I repeat that?
I just didn't hear the beginning of it. What was poetry taught?
Was literature and poetry brought alive for you at school?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to take that one, Fiona?
Yes, I mean very, very, very much so. In that we had very good teachers, as it happens. But my mother was mad about poetry, and so we had it at home as well. But I often quote this. But I remember when I was 10, learning Yeats's. That is no country for old men, the young on one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations of their song, and feeling incredibly empowered by it, including an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. Well, I was female and age 10, but the language itself sort of puffed up my sense of confidence about language. And I think, it just was exciting, and it's very accessible. It's for you. You can steal it, you can use it, it's not the academic interest in it. In fact, quite the opposite. It's about surmounting the academic interest in it. It wasn't about whether we really believe Yeats felt this. I didn't give a damn about that. I just loved the sound of it and that I was saying it.
What about you, Louise?
Well, I think I probably was taught well at school. I can't really remember learning to read, but what I can remember very intently is how really the only place to go in town was the local library. And I grew up in a small town in the East Midlands. The local library was this really unprepossessing, single-story, modern red brick building with big windows. There wasn't a great deal else to do in the East Midlands in the 1970s, it has to be said. But it was the only place. I mean, there was no sort of, Starbucks or Costa. There was nowhere else for a child or a teenager to go that wasn't home or school. It was either that or the bus shelter. Or the park. And so I would go and hide in the local library and I would work my way through the stacks. That's where I discovered the fantasy and the science fiction books. I would spend hour after hour there. And I honestly don't think I would be a novelist now if it wasn't for my very small local library in the little town that was open all day, most days. And, here's for local libraries, because when we're talking about resilience and we're talking about refuges, It's absolutely catastrophic the way they've been underfunded for so many years. And they're places of refuge and discovery. And I wouldn't be here without mine.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that, Louise. It's libraries have been such lifesavers for people in communities who don't often have access to any other, especially in lockdown, who don't have access to any other public services. I mean, a library made me a reader mostly because my mother went every 2 weeks to change over her stock of Mills and Boon novels, and so Mills and Boon turned me into the writer I am. Caleb, what about you?
My experience was slightly different. I went to a school in South London. I was fortunate. It felt like a lottery to have a teacher who felt as enthusiastic and as passionate about poetry as your mum, Fiona. But so I considered myself very lucky that I had someone whose love for poetry kind of ended up by osmosis reflecting onto the rest of the class in that way. Even the most disinterested student ended up finding some way in to poetry in that way. My friends who went other classes didn't have that same experience. And then many years later, when I was a teacher, I found myself in a very similar position where the love that I had for poetry shone through and was able to give that extra motivation to try and make poetry super interesting, because it is anyway, but I guess there's a lot of cloudedness or red tape that the curriculum itself has in its current state at the moment, that kind of made it difficult for you as a teacher to really create an environment where students felt like poetry was something that was entirely enjoyable and not necessarily for the arduous journey of getting the correct grades. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So just before just before we have the guys from Freedom from Torture come back on to talk about some of the amazing stuff that will be happening over the course of this week, a final question from Anonymous: what are each of your favourite memoirs and why? Should we start with Louise?
Oh, do you know, I nearly mentioned memoir earlier when we were talking about escapist reading, because it occurred to me that quite often reading somebody else's story, reading a kind of a well-written story that's written with novelistic skill, but you know that it's a true story, can be a terrific escape. And I read a lot of them, and I think I'm now drawing a complete blank. There's Heartberries by Therese Mailhot. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but that's an American memoir that I read recently, which I absolutely loved. And go to somebody else, because I've read so many recently that my mind is now going a complete blank. And I know there's absolutely an amazing amount of wonderful memoirs, but by the time you've gone to the other two, I will have the titles and the authors to hand.
Okay, let's go to you, Caleb.
Audrey, what's a weird sort of memoir in the sense that it is and it isn't at the same time. Audre Lorde's Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, is a it's like a myth biomythography type of thing, which I found absolutely fascinating, the concept of rewriting your own life in such a way. So I would definitely say that one.
Thank you. And Fiona?
I think a really beautiful memoir is Hisham Martyr's The Return, where he goes back to try and find his father who was disappeared under Gaddafi. And he goes back and doesn't find his father, but the journey of his return back to Libya is absolutely a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant book. I really enjoyed that. And I think I read an autobiography, but not necessarily the personal memoir, but that was a recent one I read.
And Louise, do you remember?
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to come in, having not exactly covered myself in glory before, to say that anybody who is interested in memoir, I'd really recommend a wonderful book called The Art of Memoir by Mary Carr. I hope that right.
Yes, I read that.
Which is, I mean, she's a very famous memoirist, but she actually interrogates her own art in a way that I think is really, really hilarious. And in a similar way, there's a book called Dead Babies and Seaside Towns by Alice Jolly, which is her account of surrogacy and stillbirth. And she's got some really brilliant observations while she's writing a memoir about the actual act of remembering. There's a wonderful scene in that where she talks about a very serious miscarriage that she's about to go through and how she can remember the light through the stained glass windows in her friend's hallway. And then years later, when she's writing the book, she returns and there is no stained glass window in her friend's hallway. She's completely misremembered this detail. And she also has the great line, which is, "I dislike memoir. It doesn't allow for the case for the defense," which I think is, for any of us who are writing memoirs, we need to bear that in mind. Nikesh, I believe you have form.
I have a memoir out in February, which
You do? I can't wait, actually. I've been tweeting about that. I cannot wait to read your memoir.
what? Hold on, I'll text you, Louise, because I had asked for one to be sent to you, but we'll discuss that offline. Yes, it's called Brown Baby, and it's it's a memoir about parenthood and grief, and it'll be out in February. Thank you so much to all of you for tonight. I am going to immediately go and buy Joan Didion straight after this. Probably reread Beloved, and that Alain de Botton essay collection sounds amazing. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you. I'm going to ask you guys to do the applause of the audience that they are rapturously doing in their front rooms as we speak. But I feel a little bit like it's main stage at Glastonbury. Thank you so much to Louise Doughty and to Caleb Femi and to Fiona Shaw. And we will now hand back to Freedom from Torture. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you so much to Nikesh, Fiona, Caleb, and Louise. That was just magnificent. I'm still applauding here. Thank you for a really fascinating conversation. So many inspiring moments and food for thought for book reading, for resilience, and for life in so many different ways. I will definitely remember Caleb's phrase about a book potentially saving you a few bob on therapy, which I have to say sounds like a perfect advert for literature itself. And I love the shout outs for great teachers and for public libraries too. Thank you all for joining us from home. Just to remind you all that the full Resilience reading list that includes books submitted by you will be available when the festival has finished, and that will be sent to you together with other highlights from the festival. We hope to see you here tomorrow for our second night as we come together to explore resilience through poetry and the spoken word. Please do consider donating to support survivors of torture if you can, using the button on your screen, and do make sure to check out the brilliant experiences we have available in our, I have to say, truly remarkable literary auction. Many thanks to all the astonishing gifts that have been given there. Have a good evening, and thank you all so much for your support. Thank you. Good night.